So it is really such a pleasure to be giving this talk for the Beinecke, and I want to thank Michael and I want to thank the Beinecke for inviting me to do this. As Michael said, I've been using the Beinecke in my research now for over 25 years. I was doing research there when Don Gallup was still alive and when we had to take notes by pencil and you couldn't bring a computer in. But in the fall of 2021, I had the privilege of being in residence at the Beinecke for about 3 months, which gave me even more respect for the library and everything it does. The Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas is really the only rival to the Beinecke as a repository for modern American literary archives. And as a Texas Longhorn grad and former intern at the HRC, it pains me to say this, but the Beinecke is really unparalleled, both in its collections, but also in the helpfulness and expertise of its staff. I'd be happy to talk more in the Q&A about the actual experience of doing research at the Beinecke and other libraries. I used almost 50 libraries for this book, but I do need to get on to the main event here. The dapper, mustachioed Norman Holmes Pearson looked quite like what he was, a nattily dressed English professor, an editor, and a Nathaniel Hawthorne scholar. But Pearson's appearance belied his true accomplishments. Pearson midwifed an academic field, built its dominant program, and then nudged the infant discipline to serve U.S. interests in the Cold War. He used his position at Yale and his connections with writers to promote literary modernism, especially by American women. And he was a spy. In World War II, Pearson led the pioneering OSS counterintelligence program that rolled up the Nazi spy network in Allied territory. After the war, Pearson returned to Yale to teach literature, but also served as a recruiter, and perhaps more, for the Central Intelligence Agency. 20th century American history is replete with white men whose wealth, privilege, and access permitted them to live fascinating lives at the heights of culture and government. But Pearson is unique among them, for as a professor, an editor, and a collector, he was instrumental in mainstreaming modernist art and literature. And as a spy and cultural diplomat, he helped arrange the marriage between the Academy and the national security agencies at the dawn of the Cold War. The resulting agglomeration of powerful American institutions, including higher education, the State Department and national security agencies, foundations, the publishing industry, and even the corporate world, worked in concert throughout the 1950s and 1960s to promote what we might call the vital center model of American identity and influence, both at home and abroad, until the cultural convulsions set off by Vietnam and the civil rights movement shattered that consensus. I find Pearson an utterly fascinating character, but not everyone agrees. Some years ago, I interviewed Pearson's colleague, Alan Trachtenberg, who was in the American Studies department at Yale for a very long time. And at one point, Professor Trachtenberg interrupted me to ask very frankly, why would you want to write about him? On the other hand, George Miles, a curator of American literature at the Beinecke, told me he thought that Pearson was an epic figure. Whether you conclude that he's significant or not, it is hard to deny that once you start looking into the American literary and cultural world of the mid-20th century, he just pops up everywhere, almost like Zelig from the old Woody Allen film. Today, I'd like to start by giving a brief overview of Pearson's life and career, focusing on his advocacy for and personal friendships with modernist authors, before moving on to discussing Pearson's unlikely other life as a spy master, CIA recruiter, cultural diplomat, and matchmaker between universities, foundations, and the national security state. I'll then conclude by offering up some thoughts about why, as we think of the effects of the Cold War on our cultural institutions and diplomatic agencies, it is indeed worth considering the activities of Pearson. In fact, that he might be the emblematic figure of the truncated American century that ran from the First World War to Vietnam. Like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Pearson came from ancient New England stock and was preoccupied with his own Puritan heritage and the stamp of Puritanism on the American character. His father's family had settled in Raleigh, Massachusetts in 1641, and on the slide on the left you'll see shows their plot there in central Raleigh. But by the late 1800s, the family had moved inland, initially to Vermont, and then to the industrial town of Gardner, Massachusetts, a furniture-making center where they opened a department store. Pearson's father, Chester, married Fanny Kittredge, who was from an even more eminent Yankee family, descended from the Mayflower's elder William Brewster. and Norman was born in 1909. A childhood injury suffered when he was 8 years old never fully healed and developed into tuberculosis of the hip. He endured many painful surgeries and extended hospital stays to manage this condition until penicillin resolved it when he was almost 40, but he was visibly disabled most of his life. And in 1930, when he was in college, they performed a surgery that fused his left femur to his pelvis. And so as you could see, he could never bend at the hip. And so when he sat, he always had to hang his leg off like that in those photographs. He attended public schools in Gardner and then took a postgraduate year at Phillips Andover Academy to smooth his entry into Yale. Although Yale in the 1920s was dominated by the children of the WASP establishment, Pearson wasn't among this group, falling in between the scholarship boys and the prep school aristocracy. The Pearsons were resolutely middle class, merchants, strivers. They had a Mayflower pedigree, but not much else, and their prominence came not through blood and inheritance, but from industrial and consumer capitalism, selling clothes and dry goods to the workers of a booming factory city. And the values of small-scale capitalism really did form Pearson's own political views later on. So nobody had their eyes on Pearson as a potential big man on campus when the class of 1932 matriculated in the fall of 1928. What people would have noticed about him first was his disability. He was stooped over because his left leg was 2 inches shorter than the right, and this also caused a curvature of his spine. Norm was on crutches or even in a wheelchair for long stretches of his college career, especially damaging for any shot at social prominence at sports-crazy Yale. While he didn't report any ugly incidents in letters home, in this pre-Americans with Disabilities Act era, discrimination and bias against the disabled was common. In New Haven, Pearson discovered his passion for literature, especially American literature. But because of the way American literature was taught in the elite prep schools and basically everywhere else in the 1920s, he would have understood these writers as part of a peculiar tradition, an isolated and largely underdeveloped branch of English literature that had very little intercourse with what was happening in Europe at the time. For well into the 20th century, American literature was widely viewed as merely a minor strain of English literature, with nothing characteristic to distinguish it from the writing of the mother country. Pearson also encountered the experimental literature we call modernism in these years, and developed his love for poets like Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle. But he didn't end up studying contemporary literature while at Yale, either during his undergraduate years or as a graduate student. There just wasn't any opportunity to do so. While Yale wasn't as conservative as Harvard or Princeton, essentially no universities included modernist art or literature in their curricula. His graduate work at Yale focused on American literature, and for his dissertation, he produced an edition of Hawthorne's Italian notebooks, while also working as an assistant on the project to assemble and publish all of Hawthorne's correspondence, which would eventually become his own, ultimately uncompleted, life's work. But while in graduate school, he was already working as an editor, joining the poet William Rose Beinecke in assembling the 2-volume Oxford Anthology of American Literature, which appeared in 1937. This anthology was enormously significant in that it was the first student-aimed book to weave modernism into the mainstream of the American literary tradition. Looking back at the anthologies of this time, the 1930s and 1940s, from today's perspective, this is the only one that is legible to our current understanding of the evolution of American literature. Pearson's anthology, and it really was his, both reflects and constructed this modernist heavy view of American writing. And I would also say that it's, for those of us who are interested in the history of publishing, it's also significant in that it was only the second book published by the US office of Oxford University Press. On a personal level, Pearson used this anthology to befriend many of these modernist writers and insert himself into the elite literary world. Only 26 years old, but preternaturally sociable and self-assured, Pearson used the contacts he established through this editorial work to forge long-lasting friendships with most of the leading American writers of the day. He was a graduate student given an opportunity, and like the Horatio Alger characters he so loved growing up, he made the most of it. Pearson promoted these American modernist writers through his work as an editor, anthologist, collector, teacher, literary agent, and general fixer. Especially important, though largely invisible to literary history, is his work with the library. In addition to donating his own extensive collections of rare modernist books and magazines, Pearson helped to arrange and broker Yale's purchase of the papers of writers such as H.D., Stein, William Carlos Williams, Sherwood Anderson, Eugene O'Neill, and Ezra Pound. These collections established Yale as the leading institution in modern literary studies, just as Yale itself was becoming a much more comprehensive national and international scale research institution. Anyone who has used the Beinecke for research on 19th or 20th century literature or has read work based on this research needs to thank Pearson. And that's just the modern stuff he donated. He also had extensive collections of Elizabethan books and also of boys' adventure books from the 19th century and early 20th century. He adored those. He collected them all, and he eventually donated them or sold some of them to Yale. His friendships with the writers that he collected are all interesting and unique. He was uncannily good at being what everybody wanted in a friend, a quality that eventually made him into a good spy. But his connection with Ezra Pound throughout the 1950s is particularly telling about how he worked behind the scenes. At this time, Pound was disgraced, an indicted traitor incarcerated in a mental hospital. But Pearson wanted people to read his poetry. A teacher by vocation and an editor by both experience and temperament, Pearson combined the two when he started teaching a graduate seminar on Pound in 1952. Working with Pound and his publisher, James Laughlin, Pearson enlisted his students in the task of compiling corrections to the poems, mostly by noting inconsistencies, errors, and misspellings. The students' term project was to interpret and gloss all of the references in a single poem. Most of the students turned in 5 or 6 page projects, but Tom Wolfe's, yes, that Tom Wolfe of Bonfire of the Vanities and the Right Stuff fame, produced 105 pages on Canto 47. Pearson later oversaw Tom Wolfe's dissertation after the English department had rejected it for being too political, and Wolfe then gave the eulogy at Pearson's funeral. As we think about Pearson's work as a literary critic and editor, it's well worth noting that at a time when modernist literature was seen as an almost exclusively male purview, and when Joyce, Eliot, Pound, Williams, and all of the others were still alive, and when American writers were seen as only modernist to the degree that they had made themselves European, Pearson's special interest was the American women, Gertrude Stein, Marianne Moore, pictured here, and above all, Hilda Doolittle, whom you also may know as H.D. For those women writers who needed publicity more than the notorious Pound, Pearson often started with exhibitions of the material of theirs that he had collected or that he had arranged for those writers to sell to Yale. He would then organize month-long showcases for the material in the Sterling Library nave. Crucially, Pearson would also invite literary elites from New York, publishers, critics, professors, intellectuals, and influential alumni. Featuring the work of these women in the setting of an august Gothic library at an all-male institution argued to these opinion makers that these writers were literary greats. The 1956 exhibition on H.D. was the project closest to his heart. He had known H.D. from his time editing the Oxford Anthology, but Pearson became very close with her, H.D.'s partner Bryher, and H.D.'s daughter Perdita, as they all lived in London during the second half of World War II, enduring the pervasive deprivation and the terror of the V-2 rocket barrages of 1944. After the war, when H.D. suffered a physical and mental breakdown, and the two partners, H.D. and Bryher, began living apart, Pearson became a fixture in both of their lives. For H.D., he became a kind of agent. She legally empowered him to handle all of her business affairs in the States, and in that role, he edited her new works and arranged publication for them. He oversaw Groves Press's selected edition of her poetry, which was a crucial step in establishing her as an important poet, and encouraged scholarship on H.D. by young female scholars like the late Susan Stanford Friedman. After HD's death in 1961, he acted as her admirer, her estate executor, and her hard-nosed intellectual property consultant in a decades-long project to establish her not just as the Edwardian curiosity she was generally taken to be, but rather as a central modernist poet whose late works were as essential as her better-known earlier ones. As I learned by immersing myself in their literally millions of words of correspondence, his relationship with Bryher, whom we'd probably call non-binary or genderqueer today, was more complicated and deeper. Where HD was bisexual, Bryher's romantic relationships were with women, but to stay in her family's good graces, she married over the course of her life two gay modernist artists, first Robert McAlmon, back in Paris in the 20s, and later Kenneth McPherson, who's pictured here on the left. I'm increasingly convinced, though, that in the last half of her life, Bryher's closest relationship was to Pound, and despite his own long and satisfying marriage, his was to her. They were intellectual soulmates who wrote each other, and this is not an exaggeration, at least 4 times a week for almost 30 years, and for much of that time daily. And these are not postcards. These are sometimes 4-page typed letters. As I mentioned earlier, Pearson's friendship with HD and Bryher really blossomed during the war in London. The women were there because both were British citizens, and remaining in their Swiss home base would have been too dangerous. Pearson was there because he was a spy. Not a spy, really. He was one of the top spy masters in the American intelligence service. Pearson's injury had prevented him from serving in the fighting branches once war broke out, but Yale connections brought him to the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the intelligence and covert activities agencies that General Wild Bill Donovan had designed on the model of British MI6. There, he was soon tasked with designing a counterintelligence branch for the agency that would handle the precious information the British were collecting after breaking the German Enigma coding machine. And if you've seen the Imitation Game film, that's what I'm talking about. With these decrypts, MI6 and X2 uncovered every German spy in British territory and flipped most of them into double agents. After D-Day, Pearson then led the hunt for spies, saboteurs, and stay-behinds in the French and Belgian territory the US Army was liberating as it pushed towards Germany. Despite, or perhaps even because of, his somewhat pitiable physical appearance, Pearson always immediately impressed people. He was clearly brilliant, but he was also affable and strove to make a connection with anyone he met. He collected acquaintances and assembled networks of people. He also spoke German passably well, and most important of all, knew how to make the aristocratic toffs of MI6 respect him, or at least not disdain him. 2 postgraduate years spent at Magdalen College, Oxford, had been a crash course in English upper-class culture. And throughout the war, his codename was, indeed, Puritan. As X2 chief, he was mostly an office guy, and if you see the photograph on the right, that is the building where X2 had their headquarters. I took that photograph this summer. I think they're retrofitting it into condos or something. It was mostly for British intelligence, and they stuck the Americans in the very top garret floors, which were apparently very susceptible to bombing. As chief, he was mostly an office guy, but he did make a number of dangerous cloak and dagger trips to neutral Madrid and Lisbon, where much of the highest level spying was going on. He was a commanding officer of the Art Looting Investigation Unit, which was subject of the film Monuments Men, some of you may have seen. Pearson also ushered many of his Yale students into OSS, and then eventually into careers in the national security establishment, most notably James Jesus Angleton, the ghost-like figure who rose to head of counterintelligence at the CIA. And my last film reference will be The Good Shepherd, the Matt Damon film, which is a kind of fictionalized biography of James Angleton. And there is a Pearson-esque character in there, played by Alec Baldwin. He did, despite his disability, parachute into Oslo the morning after Norway was liberated. After the war, he was offered high-level positions at the Department of State and the CIA, but chose to return to academia. He kept his hand in intelligence, though. At Yale, he was one of the most important secret CIA recruiters. Although everybody knew he had done something important in the war involving espionage, Pearson kept his mouth shut about his spy work. and he relished the reputation this gave him among colleagues and students. As one of those students told me, quote, mysteriousness hovered over him. He loved to cultivate that. And he was long one of Yale's most beloved teachers. Wry and ironic, moving deftly from technical discussions of poetry to disquisitions on the American character, his classes always sagged with waiting lists, and his students, long after they graduated, remembered his erudite, wide-ranging lectures or his enthusiastic participation as faculty advisor to clubs like the Pundits Humor Society. He was a brilliant performer who made his misshapen body part of the show, as the late literary biographer Scott Donaldson remembered. Quote, at the first meeting, Pearson would limp across the platform, reassemble himself into a sitting position, and announce, when God made me, he made me incomplete. There was a pause as the students would stare in embarrassed silence. He gave me a terrible memory, Pearson said, and I probably won't be able to call most of you by name. He was the most superbly theatrical teacher I have ever seen, Tom Wolfe, who knew something about theatricality, remembered, describing how Pearson would masterfully deploy a cigarette pack as a stage prop. He was a chain smoker basically his entire life, which certainly hastened his demise. By the end of the term, another student recalled, Pearson had kindled such devotion in his students that, quote, after the last words of Norman Pearson's final lecture had hardly been spoken, the assembled student body, some 200 strong, broke into applause, which continued for a full minute, unabated by the departure of the person for whom it was intended. But Pearson also used his teaching to promote American interests in the Cold War, particularly through helping to develop, institutionalize, and spread the scholarly field of American studies, which he had helped found, and in the first class of which in 1931, taught by Ralph Gabriel and Stanley Williams, he was a star student. After the war, U.S. diplomats in the Department of State worked with the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation to cultivate American studies around the world. Both by design and by coincidence, American studies came to intersect with the larger U.S. effort to extend its power and influence. Ultimately, this transnational public-private effort sought to cultivate understanding of and sympathy for the American culture and society in regions central to the Cold War. Good things come to people who play the game. And in the early 1960s, Pearson, an enthusiastic traveler, started to receive invitations to go abroad to lecture, to teach, or to serve as a visiting faculty member. He made several trips to East Asia and Australia to promote American studies. He came bearing gifts, the money and the institutional support of the State Department, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Ford Foundation, and Yale itself. He allocated these resources to universities abroad that were building American studies programs and that were presumably training future intellectuals and opinion leaders to be sympathetic to the United States. So, for instance, this photograph comes from the second ever meeting of the Australia-New Zealand American Studies Association. My estimation is there may have been 24 people at this meeting. However, the State Department and the United States government found it of such great priority that they sent the U.S. ambassador to Australia, and that's the man sitting behind Pearson. And although the money was in real terms quite paltry, nobody gets rich in the humanities either now or then, the importance this endeavor held to U.S. policymakers is illustrated by the presence of Ambassador Crook at this initial meeting of Ansasa. As Neville Meany, one of the organizers of this conference, remarked to me, Pearson, quote, tended to quite gently promote the Cold War cause. Later, he even trained U.S. Foreign Service employees to be cultural officers abroad. A key theme of my book is how Pearson capitalized on the growing importance and influence of institutions in American life to promote the interests of his friends, his colleagues, and his students, and how he leveraged his Yale connections to advance the interests of the writers and the causes he supported. But he also operated through the innumerable anonymous boards and committees that oversee so much of American cultural life. Just to name a few, he was a commissioner of the American Academy of Poets for years, in that capacity helping to make decisions about who would get their prestigious awards and fellowships, and thus which poets then would be offered, say, trade editions of their collected poems. He was on the selection committee for the Beinecke Poetry Prize and for the National Book Award. And after he was on the National Book Award selection committee, he then was on the committee that selected the judges for the National Book Award. He was on the Smithsonian Institution board. For 6 years, he was on the committee of the prestigious Wesleyan Poetry Series, pushing to publish people like John Ashbery. If you've been to the Mark Twain House up in Hartford, that was something else that he helped bring into existence. He was a fixer. He was an operator. He was the man who could make it happen. In short, he was the ultimate functionary, the consummate cultural bureaucrat, the joiner par excellence. What else could a disabled young man do back in the 30s to learn to advance himself? And he took advantage of the cultural capital he amassed through these activities to advance two things: his vision of American literary history, with American modernist writers at the center, and a Schlesingerian vital center understanding of American culture centered on liberal pluralism, capitalism, and the guiding role of the elite institutions that he inhabited. Spoiler alert. Although generations of Yale men took it for granted that Pearson was spying the whole time, I never uncovered any conclusive evidence of whether or not he was actually working for the CIA when he was making his trips abroad, as many people suspect. There's even fervid speculation that his relatively early death in 1975 was due to being poisoned by North Korean agents. But whether or not that's true, it's undeniable that for him, advancing the understanding of American culture and advancing American geopolitical interests were entirely congruent, and his position at the nexus of numerous bureaucratic institutions was likely more important in accomplishing that than any covert activities in which he might have been engaging. Even a spy can do his best work out in the open. Thank you.